You are listening to audio recorded at the Village Church. For more information, go to villagechurchbaltimore.com.
Right now, we are going through a short sermon series on evangelism. It's a 3-week series, and this is our 3rd week. If you missed the first 2, you can find them online on our website. 2 weeks ago, we talked about why we are to do evangelism, because it is God's appointed method to share the good news, that God's determined that He is not going to share the good news primarily through dreams and visions and writings in the sky, but He was primarily going to share the good news through normal people opening up their mouths to share the good news. And last week, we talked about some of the cultural barriers that we face today, especially in America, that prevent us from doing evangelism effectively. Because we live in a culture that is very different from what it used to be. And so we need to understand some of the challenges that we have to face. And today we're going to get practical. How exactly do we do evangelism? Also after service, today we are going to have an evangelism workshop. This is a little bit of an impromptu thing, and so we didn't really announce this before. So if nobody shows up, that's fine. I'll just be workshopping by myself. But if you're interested, basically what's going to go on is we don't have food, so you can just go grab some food real quick and then meet back around noon, and then we'll do, I've led a few random things like this in the past, so I just printed out like 10 pages of stuff, and so we're just going to basically go skim through this and go, what do we want to talk about, and then we'll talk about that. So that's sort of the plan, okay? We're not going to go through all 10 pages. You can keep the 10 pages if you want, though. That's that. If you are unable to meet after service today, but you're intrigued by the sermon series and different things were said that sort of caught your mind, and you just sort of generally have this, this idea, this notion of, I want to grow in evangelism, but you can't make it today, that's okay. What you can do is talk to me afterwards, or you can fill out a connection card and just say something like, I want to talk about evangelism, or I want to grow in evangelism, or I have some ideas about evangelism, or whatever, and then let me know, and we will do something with whatever you have to share, okay? Whatever you want to do, we can do that. Okay. If you are here today and you are not a Christian, and you're just checking this whole thing out, you're visiting our church, maybe this sermon series has been a little bit strange to you, and I just want to sort of share why we're talking about this. Okay, we're talking about this because many Christians have a little bit of a conundrum, and that conundrum is they've experienced this amazing thing called the gospel, and it's dramatically changed their lives, dramatically changed the way they view things, changed how they live for the better, and it's so amazing that they want to share that with other people. However, they don't know how. They're afraid that they would disrespect people. They're afraid they will offend people, and so they don't know how. So that's why we talk about evangelism. And it might come across weird, but if you can think about it as, if you've ever experienced something amazing, okay, politics is one example that comes to mind. Okay, so oftentimes when we think about what is inappropriate to talk about in our culture, we think of politics and religion. Those are things that are inappropriate to talk about publicly in our culture. Let's say you used to be a certain way politically, and let's say you start to, be exposed to these new ideas, and you want to share that with people. Sometimes people in this camp, they also have difficulty because they're like, oh, I don't know if it's okay for me to talk about these things with people because I don't want to offend people. I don't want to get on people's bad side. And so there's a little bit of a similar dynamic when it comes to spirituality and faith. In our culture, we privatize religion and so much that it's so weird to talk about religious things publicly. However, many Christians, we feel strongly that this has changed our lives for the better, and we just want to share that with folks. So that's why we're doing this thing called the sermon series on evangelism today. Today, we're just going to dive right into Colossians 4, 2-6, and we're just going to go through this passage, and that will sort of be the bulk of our sermon. Starting from verse 2. Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. The Apostle Paul, he's writing this letter, and he wrote this to the church in the city of Colossae. And most likely, this was several years after this church started. Most likely, there were most of the people there were new Christians, and most likely, most of the people in Colossae were either foreign to the gospel, or they just never heard of the gospel. They don't know much about it. And so it's in that context, Paul is instructing the church how to behave toward outsiders. How to behave toward outsiders. And this is very relevant to us because we live in a very similar dynamic. There are a lot of people in our culture who we are trying to share the gospel with, and many of them also do not know the gospel. And so we're going to break down this passage to 5 different things we need to do, 5 different things, 5 principles that we can take out of this passage in order to do evangelism effectively. Number 1, pray that God would open doors. Paul writes, starting from verse 2, continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ. And so this is maybe pretty rudimentary or foundational or basic, but the first thing to know about evangelism is that it cannot happen without prayer. Evangelism cannot happen without prayer. And so before we do anything at all, we need to be praying that God would open up doors. And why do we pray? Well, there's 2 reasons. First off, prayer changes us. Prayer changes us. You know, what I mean by that is I often find that I am more loving and more caring toward the people that I pray for. In fact, if you ever don't like somebody or someone rubs you the wrong way, just pray for them, and soon enough you'll find that you actually will love them quite a lot. Because the more you pray for them, the more God changes your heart for that person. And so when I pray for people who are not Christians, I often find myself loving on them, looking for ways to serve them, looking for ways to have spiritual conversations with them. So that's the first thing prayer does. It changes us. And the second thing that prayer does is prayer changes hearts. Prayer changes hearts. We've been talking about evangelism strategies and all that. But ultimately, the effectiveness of our evangelism does not depend on our ability to communicate, on our knowledge of the Bible, on our wisdom or our strategy. The effectiveness of our evangelism depends on God's ability to change hearts. God's ability to change hearts. That is the foundation for evangelism, and therefore we pray that God would intervene, that God would change hearts. You know, think about this for a moment. Like, let's imagine you are not a Christian, okay? And imagine, you have non-Christian beliefs. Maybe you don't believe God exists. And then you have these non-Christian habits. Maybe you sleep in on Sundays. And then you have these non-Christian values. Maybe your life goal is you want to make a lot of money, you want to travel the world, fill in the blank. So you have these non-Christian beliefs, these habits, these values. How did you get these things? Well, they were instilled in you. You sort of inherited them. You sort of grafted them into your life through a variety of means, from maybe your family, from your TV shows, from conversations, from books you've read. So friends or mentors, you've inherited all these beliefs, these habits, these values, these way of doing things. It's taken your whole life, in a sense, to get you where you are today. Why in the world would you choose to abandon all of that, to abandon your beliefs, your habits, and values that took your whole life to get there? Why would you abandon all those things and then start following Jesus and then adopt these new beliefs and habits and values? It goes against everything that's familiar. It goes against everything that life has taught you. Why would someone choose to do that? Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 2:14, the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him. And he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. And so when you have, just imagine you're this non-Christian, you have the set of beliefs and these habits, these rituals, these values, okay? You look at Christianity. If you were to look at Christianity, it would come across as folly to you. That's what Paul is saying in this passage. It would come across as ridiculous to you because it goes against everything that you've ever learned. You just see this belief system that just seems jumbled up, it seems confusing, it seems contradictory, and you might wonder, why would anyone believe in that? Why would anyone believe in that? However, if God himself intervened in this natural person's life and gave this person spiritual eyes, spiritual ears, spiritual hearts, then they will see and understand things they wouldn't have been able to do so otherwise. And so if evangelism is on your heart, before you do anything at all, pray. Pray for specific people in your life, maybe your neighbors, maybe your coworkers, maybe your family members. Pray for specific people who don't know Jesus, and pray that God would intervene in their lives and soften their hearts. That God would give them spiritual eyes and spiritual ears and spiritual hearts. And pray for open doors. And what I mean by that is pray for opportunities to pop up where you can have an opening to share, so it wouldn't feel like you're forcing a conversation. You'd have opportunities where you could talk about the gospel in a way that people would be open and receptive. Pray for opportunities to talk about spiritual things. Pray for opportunities for you to share the gospel. That's number one. Number two, speak boldly and clearly. I want to read Colossians 4, starting from verse 3 again. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear, which is how I ought to speak. Paul, he's stating his intentions. He's praying that God would allow him to declare the gospel, and he's referring to the gospel as a mystery. This is a mystery, and he's saying this task of evangelism is essentially to verbally declare this mystery so that this mystery is now clear, so that this mystery is now understandable. You know, we can talk about evangelism strategies all we want, but at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is we just need to do it. When we need to do it boldly and clearly. You know, sometimes we think, I don't want to do evangelism because I don't want to offend people. You know, and I relate to that, okay? Nobody here, I'm guessing, nobody here enjoys offending people, okay? Nobody enjoys offending people. I don't like offending people. I'm not that confrontational of a person. You know, I don't like conflict. Some of you might know my legal name, my first name is Lawrence. I go by Larry, but on my driver's license, on my birth certificate, it's Lawrence. And one time in 10th grade, I went to the summer camp. And at the summer camp, I signed up as Lawrence. And so I wore this lanyard name tag, Lawrence. And it was 1 month. And this whole month, everyone was calling me Lawrence. And I was so non-confrontational. I so didn't want to offend people. I never corrected anybody. And even though my whole life, you know, people called me Larry, at this one summer camp for 1 month, everyone called me Lawrence, and I just didn't want to offend people. I didn't want to correct people. So that's how non-confrontational I am. Okay, that's how so much I don't want to offend people I am. And even to this day, the only people who call me Lawrence are those Facebook friends I have, you know, who from back then, and you know, they call me Lawrence. Anyways. At the end of the day, when it comes to evangelism, we need to ask ourselves, not that we want to be offensive, but if it takes potentially being offensive to do evangelism, am I willing to do that? Am I willing to do that? Because if you're in the sermon series and this whole time you're looking for some strategy or some method that will be 100% offensive proof, you know, so that you can share the gospel in a way that has zero chance of offending anybody, frankly, that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. There isn't anything like that out there. Why? Because evangelism sometimes is offensive, and there just simply isn't anything we can do about this. Sometimes, you know, as we mentioned last week, sometimes we are offensive, sometimes our tone is offensive, sometimes the words we choose are offensive, and we can change those things. But sometimes the gospel is plain old offensive, and we can't do anything about it. And catch what Paul wrote, right? He says he wants to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison. Okay, so Paul is writing from prison. So think about this for a second, okay? We're thinking, I don't want to do evangelism, it's offensive. And meanwhile, Paul's evangelism was so offensive, it landed him in prison. Paul's evangelism was so offensive, it landed him he ended up in prison for it. So I'm not saying we need to try to end up in prison, okay? That's not our goal. But I'm just saying, try to compare and contrast our mentality sometimes with Paul's mentality. We're trying our best not to be offensive, and Paul, he's saying, I'm in prison because I'm sharing the gospel. Sometimes I think about this. I'm just theorizing. I think about at the end of our lives, the Bible says that God will say to us, well done, good and faithful servant. Sometimes I wonder if God will, or maybe some angels will present accolades or certificates or trophies and things like that. And I think of Paul, maybe he'll have a trophy that says something like, Paul, church planting pioneer, dedicated his life to sharing the gospel or something like that. And I imagine, what if there's someone who, never did evangelism? What would they say? Larry never shared the gospel, but did a great job of never offending anybody. Larry did a great job of never offending anybody. So, I'm with you. I know we want to be liked, okay? We don't want to give Christians a bad name. We want to be careful. We want to be kind. We want to be all those things. But here's my fear. My fear is that our desire to not be offensive has crippled our evangelism. Our desire to not be offensive has crippled our evangelism so that we're not doing evangelism at all. And it's taken so many well-intentioned Christians out of the game. And here's what we do as Christians sometimes. Sometimes we look at all the people who are doing evangelism poorly, and we go, wow, that's offensive. Oh, wow, that's rude. Oh, wow, that's insensitive. Oh, well, that's culturally obsolete, irrelevant. That's awkward. And we look at all these people who are doing it wrong, and we just say, oh, look at all these people. They're just giving Christians a bad name. And meanwhile, we don't do any evangelism at all. We're just so busy pointing our fingers at people who are doing evangelism poorly, and meanwhile, we're not doing anything. And it's like, anything. It's so much easier to tell people they're doing a bad job if you're not doing it, right? Let's say you're watching. Maybe you've had this experience. I've had this experience. You're watching someone they're trying to unscrew a rusty screw, or they're trying to take out a rusty nail, and they're struggling, and you go man, what's this guy doing? Let me give it a shot. I can do that. And you go and you try to give it a shot, and you're like, oh, this is pretty hard. This is pretty hard. I thought you were just a weak sauce, but this is pretty hard. Or sometimes if you think about parenting, okay, some of us, you might be new parents. Before I was a new parent, I had all these goals of my parents were like this, so I'm not going to be like this. Or my parents never did this, so I'm going to do this. And so I had these goals about how I didn't want to be like my parents in so many different ways. And then you become parents and you realize, oh, parenting is pretty hard. There's a lot. I understand why my parents struggled. I understand why my parents aren't perfect. Right? And it's the same with evangelism. Sometimes it's easy to tell people who are doing evangelism that they're doing everything wrong. But the thing is, at least they're doing evangelism. At least they're doing it. And what's more important, how we are doing evangelism or whether we are doing evangelism at all? Dwight L. Moody, he's this pastor, lived a while ago, and one time someone was telling him how all the ways he was doing evangelism poorly, and this is what he said: "It is clear you don't like my way of doing evangelism. You raised some good points. Frankly, I sometimes do not like my way of doing evangelism, but I like my way of doing it better than your way of not doing it." Sometimes I wonder if all of our criticism of all of our evangelism strategies, it's worthwhile. We need people to be critical of the way we do evangelism. But sometimes I wonder if our criticism of all of these evangelism strategies is just a defensive mechanism. It's just a way to justify the fact that deep down inside, we're afraid of offending people. So we don't want to do it. And so to make up for it, we criticize all these people who do offend people. I went through a little bit of this paradigm shift when I was in college, because I didn't really do much evangelism before college. But the more I grew in my faith in college, the more I felt this conviction. I needed to share Jesus with people who didn't know. But I didn't know how to do it. I just knew I had this basic conviction, this desire, and I felt this burden. But I was afraid of offending people. But I just sort of came to the point, what? I have to get over this. I just need to do this. And at this time, I was studying civil engineering, and I was living in this big house. And there were 11 people in this house. I think there were 3 Christians and 8 non-Christians. And I was living in this house, and I remember feeling like I can't go this whole year not ever saying a word to these people. And so I just said, I don't know what to do, but I'm just going to do it. So I'm going to schedule a house meeting. So I emailed everyone, and I scheduled a house meeting, and they all showed up. And I just stood up, and I gave a 5-minute summary of Christianity. Okay, that's just what I did. I was nervous as heck, but that's what I did. And I did this, okay? And then I sat down, and there were a few seconds of silence. It felt like forever. And then one guy, he was sort of the class clown of the house. He just stood up, and he started clapping. And he was like, "Bravo, Larry, great job. You should be a preacher." And then he sat down, and then someone else was like, we need to figure out our chores situation. I picked trash duty, and then we just moved on to chores, and then that was sort of the end of that. And that was it, okay? And sometimes I think back about that. One, it blows my mind that I even did that sometimes. I can't even believe I did that. But 2, sometimes I wonder, was that effective? Like, did any of those people's lives change? What I did I bring them closer to Jesus or further away from Jesus? I ask all these questions all the time. Like, I don't know. To be honest, I don't know. But I think what that experience did for me was, I don't know if it impacted them, but it impacted me, because it was one of the first times in my life where I decided, you know what, for the sake of the gospel, it's okay to be offensive. I look back on the day and I think, for once in my life, I communicated the gospel boldly and clearly. You know, it might not look the same to you. I'm not saying you should do that same exact thing. It might take on different forms, a different context. But my point is, if your life goal is you never want to offend anybody, you'll just never do evangelism. You'll never get there, because evangelism requires taking the risk that potentially you might offend somebody. It requires not shying away from having hard conversations. It requires intentionally choosing to be bold and clear. Number 3, spend time with non-Christians. Spend time with non-Christians. Verse 5 says, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. This word walk has this connotation of conducting yourself in a certain way. It's this connotation of regularly doing these things as a habit. And Paul, essentially, he's saying we are to regularly engage in wisdom with outsiders, making the best use of the time. And so there's 2 things I want to point out here. First off, we need to regularly spend time with people who don't know Jesus. Regularly spend time with people who don't know Jesus. Some Christians, especially those who are newer to the faith, they do a great job of this, because before they were Christians, they spent a lot of time with non-Christians. A lot of people who are Christians, especially those who have been maybe spent their whole lives in the church, almost all of their friends are Christians, and they don't do a good job of regularly spending time with non-Christians. And so maybe they got the Christian books, they got the Christian music, they got the Christian podcasts, the Christian movies. Everything they ever do is Christian, and so there is zero opportunity, zero chance for them to spend time with non-Christians. And so if that's you, I want to encourage you, somehow find a way to regularly and intentionally spend time with people who don't know Jesus. And we do this because it helps you and it helps them. It helps you because if you live in a Christian bubble, you just simply cannot do evangelism effectively, right? You'll be speaking Christian jargon. You won't be understanding their cultures. So by regularly spending time with non-Christians, you can be better at understanding who people are. You can understand how the gospel is relevant to their lives. So that helps you. And it helps them because, we mentioned this last week, many people have stereotypes of Christians. Many people think Christians are this and this and this. And so when you spend time with them, then they'll think, oh, Christians, go to Orioles games. Or Christians listen to NPR. Or Christians have bad days. And so they have these mentalities or these stereotypes of Christians, but by you hanging out with them, spending time with them, they go, oh, wow, I am more similar to Christians than I thought I was, right? And so that's the first thing, spend time with a lot of non-Christians, and maybe some of you already do that, and if that's you, maybe you need to work on the second part, which is make the best use of the time. Make the best use of the time. And what I mean by that is, don't just hang out blindly and hang out with no direction and hang out and then, you're hanging out for years and they don't even know you're a Christian, okay? What I mean by making the best use of the time is look for opportunities to learn. Look for opportunities to serve. And look for opportunities to speak. It's not mindlessly hanging out. It's intentionally hanging out, intentionally asking questions. Ask them what movies they like to watch. Ask them what they do when they have free time. Ask them why they chose their career. Ask them, who their heroes are, who their mentors are, who they look up to. Ask them what life events have shaped who they are. Ask them what they want to get out of life. And when you ask these questions, and listen, by the way, you don't just ask to ask. And listen, when you ask these questions, you learn about them, and then you start to learn how the gospel is relevant in their lives. You learn how the gospel is relevant in their lives. Because, and here's this thing, everybody, I don't know if you realize this, every single person is looking for the gospel. Every single person is looking for the gospel. It's just that many people don't realize it. Many people, they think they're looking for security, or they think they're looking for community, or they think they're looking for joy, or they think they're looking for love. But what they are truly looking for is the gospel. And so what you got to do is just spend time with people, ask them questions, find out what they are looking for, and then let them know, oh, you know what, can I share with you something? I think you're actually looking for the gospel. Spend time with non-Christians, make the best use of the time. Number 4, speak graciously and attractively. Let your speech, this is verse 6, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt. Paul here uses this analogy of salt, and salt has this amazing ability. I don't know if you've ever eaten foods with salt before. I have. It's a pretty amazing experience, okay? Salt has this amazing ability to make boring foods come to life. Salt has this amazing ability to make boring foods come to life. Take whatever food you like, okay? Even something like chocolate, okay? I thought that chocolate, would have been good if it was just sweet, but chocolate with sea salt, that's another level, okay? Take any food you want, if you just add some salt on it, all of a sudden, it tastes so much better. Why is it? Why does it taste so much better? Because salt brings out qualities of that thing that you wouldn't have known otherwise. And so Paul is saying, we need to sprinkle salt on our speech. And what does it mean to sprinkle salt on our speech? It means, he says, let your speech always be gracious. Always be gracious. And so this is really key, because Paul's saying it's not enough just to have the right content. You also need to have the right tone. It's not enough just to know what to say. You also need to know how to say it. It's not enough just to have truth. You also need grace. Because you can speak truth all you want, but it will fall on deaf ears unless your speech is seasoned with grace. Speaking with grace has this powerful effect, just like salt, of changing how your speech is perceived. Okay? Without grace, your evangelism will seem rude, it will seem condescending, it will seem judgmental, it will seem hypocritical. But with salt, all of a sudden, your evangelism will come across as gentle, as friendly, as attractive. And I'm sure we've all have this, we've all had this experience before, where maybe someone told you to do something, and you were so offended by what this person said, and then later someone else says the exact same thing to you, but with grace, and you go, oh wow, that's a really good idea. I should do that. I've done that before. And why is that? Why were you so offended by the first person, but you're okay with the second person, even though they were saying essentially the same thing? Because this person said it with grace. So therefore, even though we speak boldly and clearly, we also need to make sure we're speaking graciously and attractively. Sometimes we think of Jesus' preaching as, confrontational and aggressive, but if you just read the Gospels, you'll notice that Jesus, most of the time when he was aggressive and confrontational, he was talking to super religious people. But when he was talking to people who were on the outside, people who didn't know God, his speech was often filled with grace. In fact, Luke says in Luke 4:22, and all spoke well of him, this is Jesus, all spoke well of Jesus and marveled at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. And that's what we should be aiming for as well. So talk with grace. Number 5, have dialogue. Have dialogue. Verse 6, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each question. So this is really key, because notice how Paul is framing this conversation we're having. Sometimes when we think about evangelism, we're just thinking monologue. We're thinking, we need to tell you this thing. Okay, you listen, I talk, I'm going to tell you this thing. And so you listen. But Paul is assuming that they are going to ask us questions. Paul is assuming that he's going to ask us questions. And so this is really important to know about evangelism. If you're giving a monologue and they're not asking a single question, you might not actually be doing evangelism very well. Okay? Evangelism oftentimes is a dialogue. You know, because if it is a monologue, in our culture, just to be frank, it will come across as if you're trying to implement an agenda, or come across as you're trying to complete a sale, or come across as you're trying to go through a script. And so today, especially in our culture, more than anything else, we need to make sure our evangelism is a dialogue, and there's a back and forth. And you see this in the scriptures as well. You see this a lot. Peter at Pentecost, people ask Peter, oh, what should we do? Or when the conversation with Philip and the Ethiopian, you see, actually, we can read right here. In Philip, in Acts 8. In Acts 8, Philip is talking to this guy. He sees this guy who's an Ethiopian government official, and he runs up to him, starting from verse 30. So Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet and asked, do you understand what you're reading? And he said, how can I unless someone guides me? And catch this. And he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. He invited Philip to come up and sit with him. That's what we're looking for, okay? We're not looking for people who are just minding their own business and they don't care about evangelism or they don't care about the gospel, and we'll just interrupt their lives and just give them this monologue, okay? We're looking for a chance to have conversations so that they are interested, they're inviting you to speak. Part of evangelism is, you see this in the scriptures all the time, part of evangelism is people asking you questions and you answering those questions. So do you catch this? There's a back and forth. This Ethiopian asked a question, invited Philip to join in the conversation. That's a dialogue, okay? So I just gave these 5 points. Okay, so you're thinking about all these things, and you're just thinking, okay, I understand these principles, okay, but how do I start? How do I start? Okay, I understand, okay, I need to spend time with non-Christians, so let's say I'm spending time with non-Christians, okay, what do I do now? Okay, well, I'm just going to give you, this is practical, I don't really have an organized way of doing this, so I'm just going to give you a bullet list of things, okay? There's no formula, okay? There isn't a 100% effective evangelism, kit or whatever, but here are just some tips, just from my personal experience, from books I've read, just from talking to people. Okay, here's just a list. Number 1, let people know that you are a Christian. Let people know that you are a Christian. For many of you, this is a significant hurdle, okay? And it's okay to be honest with that. If you're there, that's fine to recognize that. But at some point, in order to be effective, it has to come out somehow, okay? And here's just some practical ways to let it come out. If someone asks, how was your weekend? Okay, sometimes people ask those questions in everyday life. You can say something like that, something like, it was pretty good. I spent Saturday hanging out with my family, and I enjoyed my church service on Sunday. Okay? You can just drop that, okay? You don't need to push it any further. Just say that. And you're not lying, okay? Hopefully you're not lying, okay? But you're just honestly answering the question, okay? And then maybe they won't catch it the first time. They'll just say, oh, maybe, he was, I don't know, he was just volunteering at a church. But if that happens enough, okay, here's a few other examples, okay? Let's say you have a community group on Wednesday night, and someone goes, hey, are you free to hang out on Wednesday night? Okay, you can say something like, oh, sorry, every Wednesday I hang out with a group of friends from church. Every Wednesday I hang out with a group of friends from church, okay? And what that does is it puts in their mind, oh, this person goes to church, and this person's pretty committed, hangs out every week with this group of friends from church, okay? Or maybe, here's the next level. This is a little bit more extreme, okay? Someone's saying, oh, he's sharing with you, he's going through a tough time, okay? He's struggling with something like that. You listen to them, you ask them questions, you learn about it, and then you can just say something like, wow, that must be tough. I'll definitely be praying for you in your situation, okay? You're not saying anything further. You're not pushing religion down their throats. You're just honestly expressing how you feel, right? But what those things do, okay, is it shows people, or if they didn't know before, that you are a Christian and you take your faith seriously. Is it weird to say those things? Maybe it's weird to say those things, but I think it's just being authentic, right? It's just being authentic. How would someone react if they were friends with you for years, you hung out every week, and then years down the road, they find out, oh, you're a Christian? I had no idea. That would come across as really weird. That would be really unauthentic, right? And so what will it communicate if we hang out for years and we never mention Jesus? It will communicate that either you're not authentic or Christianity is not much of a priority in your life. Right, so at some point it needs to come out. Okay, number 2, drop spiritual appetizers. Drop spiritual appetizers, and this concept is from a book called God's Space by Doug Pollock, and it's a great book. It's really short. You can read it in a few hours. But essentially, a short spiritual appetizer is a short personal story that invites spiritual curiosity. A short spiritual story, 2 minutes or less, that invites spiritual curiosity. For example, if there was a time in your life when you didn't go to church regularly or you didn't identify as a Christian, but now you do, okay, that's a short personal story. You can just mention that somehow. If there's an opportunity to mention that, you can mention that, and it invites curiosity. Or maybe if there was a church event that you were a part of and you really enjoyed your time, you just mention that, okay? You're not forcing anything on anybody, you're just mentioning that. If you had something you were praying for in your life and it was answered, and you're really thankful it was answered, you can just mention that. Again, you're not pushing any agenda, you're just being authentic with who you are, and you're dropping these spiritual appetizers. And what this does is it helps, because sometimes people, they see Christianity as theoretical and abstract. What this does is it helps people see Christianity as personal and relevant, because they see Christianity working out in your lives. Okay? Here's another thing. Ask spiritual questions. Ask spiritual questions. There's this book called Questioning Evangelism by Randy Newman. I also recommend that. I have a whole list of books anyways. The whole premise is that Jesus and the early apostles, oftentimes when they were doing evangelism, they were asking questions. And so, therefore, we need to ask questions. Questions like, why do you believe that? Or why do you say that? What has your experience with religion been like? What has your experience with religion like? Or if, hypothetically, if God existed, what do you think God would be like? Okay, sometimes evangelism is a one-sided conversation. We talked about that, monologue versus dialogue. And what asking questions does is it invites people to participate, to become active participants in the conversation. But I do want to let you know, if you're asking questions and someone doesn't feel comfortable, doesn't want to talk about it, that's totally fine. Don't push it. That's okay, okay? But sometimes you ask questions and you might find out people are actually willing to talk about it, okay? Another one, find common ground. Find common ground. If someone shares that he or she had negative experiences with church, okay, maybe they grew up in a youth group and they didn't like the church, or you can fill in the blank. And if you ever had any negative experience with the church, maybe some of you have, maybe there's a pastor you didn't get along with, maybe you went to a group and it was really awkward, that you can share that too. And what that does is it gives you common ground, okay? Let's say sometimes maybe non-Christian will say something like, I don't like it when, Christians, they mix church and state. They mix church and politics together. And if you don't like that, you can say that too. You can say, I also don't like it when Christians mix, church and politics together. What that does, okay, is it brings them onto your team, right? Because sometimes non-Christians, they have this mentality, I'm a non-Christian, I'm on this team, you're a Christian, you're on that team, and so we have these disagreements. But a lot of the times, okay, what non-Christians don't realize is they are in agreement with Christians on a lot of different things, okay? And so what you're doing is you're helping them to see, actually, I'm on your team. I'm on your side. I agree with you, okay? And lastly, highlight Jesus. Highlight Jesus. It's amazing, I hinted at this earlier, it's amazing how desperate people are for Jesus without even realizing it. And so when you get to know people, when you ask these questions, when you learn about people, when you find common ground, and you notice trends and patterns and desires, it's they're almost asking for Jesus, okay? And so it's just as simple as, okay, I think you're actually looking for Jesus. For example, you can say something like, you mentioned that you've been turned off by religious people, because religious people, these overly bigoted, judgmental people, and I'm totally with you. In fact, that's why Jesus spent most of his ministry condemning religious people who are bigoted and judgmental. Okay, so what you're doing is you're saying you have this view of religious people, they're bigoted and judgmental. Jesus is on your team. That was a core part of Jesus' ministry. He also was condemning people who are bigoted and judgmental. Okay, here's another example. It seems like it rubs you the wrong way when Christians are legalistic and uptight. And you can say, it's a shame that so many Christians are like that because Jesus definitely wasn't like that. In fact, Jesus' reputation was he was always hanging out at parties. And in fact, his first miracle was he turned water into wine at a party. Okay? And so what you do is sometimes people have this mentality, Christianity, they're just uptight, they're legalistic, they never have any fun. And so you're saying Jesus is on your team. Jesus was fun. Okay? Here's another example. I don't like how religion divides people. Sometimes people say stuff like that. I don't like how religion divides people. And you go, that's exactly right. I agree. I hate it when religion divides people. And that's why I love Christianity, because at the heart of Christianity is a God who became a man to die for his enemies. At the heart of Christianity is a God who became a man to die for his enemies. And there's nothing that unites people than a message like that. Okay? And when you say stuff like this, what it does is it helps people understand that they have these impressions of Christianity, of this institutionalized religion, but they're actually wanting Jesus, and they didn't even realize it in the first place. This is key to highlight Jesus, because so often when non-Christians think about Christian evangelism, they're just thinking, here's this guy, who's doing evangelism, and what he's trying to do is essentially he's trying to say, my life is better than yours, so you should be like me. But that's not what evangelism is. Evangelism is not to get people to be like us, it's to get people to be like Jesus. So you want to make sure we're highlighting Jesus. Maybe you're hearing all of this and you're thinking, I don't know if I can do all that. It sounds intimidating. Okay, I broke it down to practical steps, but it still sounds intimidating. That's okay. Ultimately, I want you to know, as Christians, we believe that God loves us no matter what. Regardless of how well or how poorly we do evangelism, regardless of how often we do evangelism, God loves us no matter what, and we are loved by God, not because we are good at saving people, but because God himself is good at saving people. And so if you feel tempted to do evangelism out of guilt or fear, if those are your motivating factors, I just want to give you permission, just rest. Okay? Don't be so worked up over doing these things if you don't feel healthy enough in who you are in Jesus, in God's eyes. Okay? Just slow down. Okay? You don't have to do evangelism this week. Just rest in the fact that Jesus gives you freedom. But maybe some of you are hearing this and you're thinking, okay, this is intimidating. I'm a little bit nervous, but I want to give this a try. I want to share Jesus with people who don't know Jesus. But to be honest, I don't know how effective it will be. I just don't know. I have a lot of doubts. I have a lot of skepticism in this whole thing. And if that's you, welcome to the club. Okay? Welcome to the club. Everybody has doubts. Everyone is skeptical. And everybody has scenarios where you do evangelism and it falls flat. Okay? Think about this. Jesus, the founder of our faith, did evangelism, and he was killed for it. Okay? No one is better at evangelism than Jesus. Okay? He did evangelism, and he was killed for it. So obviously, sometimes we're going to do evangelism, and it's going to fall flat. That's normal. Okay? Sometimes people won't be receptive. That's okay. Sometimes we're so results-oriented in how we do things, and we never want to attempt anything that we know we won't do 100% really awesome at. Sometimes that's how we treat life in general. We're not good at painting. We're not going to paint. We're not good at hammering. We're not going to hammer. We're not good at singing. We're not going to sing. And so that's how we have this mentality. But here's the thing. Evangelism is not about the results. Evangelism is not about the results. And, God never calls us to produce results. All God does, he calls us to open up our mouths and to share the gospel. That's all he does. And God will take care of the results. So we don't need to be afraid that we won't produce good results. All we need to do is be faithful to the calling. And we need to be authentic to the fact that God has changed our lives so that we can share it with others. I want to pray in a little bit, but before we go in there, I'm going to put these two questions up, or the slides team, they can put these two questions up on the board. And during our communion time, I just want you to think about these two questions. Number one, what prevents you from doing evangelism? What prevents you from doing evangelism? Is it fear? Is it pride? Is it anxiety? Whatever it is, ask God to replace that with love. Ask God to replace that with love. Love for God, love for others. And number two, who is God calling you to share the gospel with? Who is God calling you to share the gospel with? Think about all the people in your life who jumps out at you. It might be a neighbor, it might be a friend, it might be a coworker, it might be a family member. Whoever it is, spend some time praying for that person. Pray that God would open up a door for you to share the gospel. And when that moment comes, pray that you would have boldness. Pray that you would have grace to speak. Let's pray. Romans 10:1 says, "Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved." Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. God, maybe some of us don't have that heart. Maybe, just to be honest, we feel hard-hearted, or we feel jaded. We feel so skeptical of evangelism that we sort of dismissed it from our minds altogether. We don't think it's for us. We just simply don't have a heart for it. And we listen to messages like this, and, it might tickle our senses here and there, but at the end of the day, we know our lives won't change. We've sort of already given up before we started. God, I pray that you would change our hearts. I pray that you would grow our hearts. I pray that you would break our hearts with the things that break your heart. I pray that you would open up our eyes and see the harvest, and that you would give us the willingness to walk into the harvest, and to open up our mouths and to share your gospel. Maybe some of us, we have that heart, we have this conviction, we have this fire, but we still feel nervous, we feel scared, we feel anxious, we feel lack of confidence, and we just feel this extreme inability, this extreme lack of knowledge. We feel unprepared, ill-equipped. God, we thank you that it's not about us, it's not about our ability, it's about your ability to save. Remind us that we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to all. So I pray that you give us courage and confidence. I pray that you remind us that you are with us to the end. God, maybe some of us feel guilty. We hear messages like this, we feel guilty. We feel ashamed. We feel, how I have this message, but I just hold it to myself and I don't tell anybody. I just keep it to myself. And how could I do such a thing? And God, remind us that your gospel sets us free. Your gospel gives us freedom. Remind us that our message is not just the message for those on the outside, it's the message for us too. And it's a message of grace. So that as we share it with others, that we share it with ourselves. And this message is that even though we fall flat on our face, even though we fail, even though we don't do what we're supposed to do, you love us anyways. You sent your son to die for us anyways. And you've forgiven us already. And so we have freedom, we have joy, we have perfect community with you. We are not condemned no matter what we do. We thank you for Jesus, and I pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Feel free to take some time to think about these two questions on your own, and then when you're ready, come up and take communion. Communion is when we remember the death of Jesus. Take the bread that represents Jesus' body, dip it in the grape juice that represents Jesus' blood shed for us, and remember that Jesus died for us. Ultimately, our evangelism is not about us. It's about this message that we have, this message we believe, and that is that Jesus died and rose again.